promised land. One of the things you got to understand is there were giants in the promised land at that time. When the Israelites came into the promised land, they defeated giants. Not one giant, plural, giants. All right? Giants were not, they weren't something that was, stood in their way and stopped them from, going through the promise. Joshua fought giants. Caleb fought giants, plural. The Israelites fought giants when they came into the promised land. Now, years and years and years have passed, and here we go, and we're standing here. And in chapter 17, here comes a giant, one giant, named Goliath from Gath, who shows up and stands up against the Israelites and starts mocking God and doing all this stuff. And guess what? They're afraid. I like how this says it in, let me go here, verse 11 of chapter 17. And when Saul and the Israelites heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. They were greatly afraid. It wasn't something they were just kind of afraid. They were seriously afraid. This was like a big deal to them. And that's what the funny thing, the irony of this whole thing is, these guys had destroyed giants before. And there's just one giant standing there. And the cool thing about it, really, when you read this whole chapter of David and Goliath, one of the things you miss is Goliath is calling Saul out. He's not, standing up trying to just start a fight. He's calling the king out, because the Bible says that Saul stood head and shoulders above everyone in Israel. Saul was, I don't know if that meant he was 7 foot tall or whatever. I don't know. Maybe the Israelites were 4 or 5 foot and he was 6, and it was a big deal. But, whatever the case may be, he was a big, tall man that stood out. He stood out. There was something about him that stood out. And Goliath was calling him out. And Saul wouldn't go. He was afraid. And so when you have, when you're a leader, when you've got this great army and their leader's afraid, he's just sitting there and just, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to go out. These guys were afraid. They're terrified of this giant. Isn't it funny that when you say, oh, well, the doctor says I have this little thing on my skin, and it could be cancer. And you got someone else saying, oh, yeah, that probably, my uncle died of that kind of cancer. Oh, my grandma died of that kind of cancer. And then someone else goes, oh, yeah, oh, man, so-and-so had that same thing, and he died a week later. And next thing you know, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It's funny, Goliath might have not really been that tall, but by the time everything was said and done and David shows up, this Goliath is 20 feet tall, and there's no way anybody's going to do anything about him. Because that's what fear does to you. Fear manipulates your perception of reality. You see what I'm saying? Let's look at this here. Let's go ahead and go to verse 41. Now, the Israelites were afraid. Fear saw the giant. But what did David see? David saw an opportunity. It's amazing that when David shows up, he starts talking to people and saying, here's this giant out there, this Philistine standing in the battleground there, and he's yelling and making fun of God and saying all these horrible things. And David's like, well, what the heck's going on here? How can this guy be standing out here doing this and nobody's doing anything about it? And then, everybody's afraid, and they're like, oh, well, the king said whoever will go out there and do something about it, they'll get all this stuff. And David's like, what do you get if you kill this guy? You see, David saw an opportunity. One of the cool things is your family got free of taxes. You don't pay taxes anymore. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine going to the store, when you're going to buy something, and they go, oh, that's going to be so-and-so, and you go, no, I don't pay taxes. I killed Goliath. That would be pretty amazing, When the IRS, when you have to send your little thing on at the end of the day, you just put, exempt, I killed Goliath. But that's what David, for killing Goliath, that's what the person who kills Goliath, they're free, them and their family and all of Israel. They don't have to pay taxes anymore. They're going to get wealth. Hey, they're going to get the king's daughters. You're going to get married into the king's family. Saul was desperate. So David didn't see the giant, he saw the opportunity. And look at this in verse 41. The Philistine came on and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine also said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. And I can totally preach on that for another hour, but I'm just going to skip past it. But that's amazing. The Lord of hosts, that means the God of the armies. The God of the armies of Israel, the Lord of hosts, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down, and I will remove your head from you, and I will give the dead bodies of the armies of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all the assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into my hands. Then it happened that when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag and took a stone and slung it, and struck the Philistine in his forehead. And the stone sunk into his forehead, so that he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine, and took his sword and drew it out of his sheath, and killed him, and cut his head off with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now, what did David do here? David, when he came and faced Goliath, he did not face Goliath in fear. He did not face Goliath. He faced Goliath with his perspective in the right place. He saw God as being bigger than the giant. He saw God as being bigger than Goliath. And when he stood, he said, I'm not coming at you with all these weapons. I'm not coming at you in my own strength. See, that's the thing. When you walk in fear, you basically have only what you have to provide. If you live in fear, for instance, I love when people say, I can't give because I don't have no money, or I can't tithe because I don't have no money. And it's funny because when you live in that kind of fear, all you have is what you have. But when you give to God, when you take a part of what you got and you give, then God can increase that, so you get more. You see, that's the funny thing. People don't think of it. They think of it as, okay, I only have $100. How the heck am I going to take care of all this stuff? Well, guess what? If you give to God part of that, then he's going to give you more so you can take care of all of it. But if you don't, and you walk in fear and worry that you're not going to have enough money, then what's going to happen is even the little you got isn't going to be enough. Because you're on your own strength. You're trusting in your own strength. And that's the sad thing, and this is what ends up happening. The point of the story here is, I wanted to point out, now you got David, this great man of faith. And it says actually at the end of the story, he takes the head of Goliath and the weapons of Goliath and puts them in his tent. So it's a reminder. It's a memorial of what he did. I don't know how long he kept the head. Hopefully not too long, because that's pretty gross. But he had this head, and it was a memorial to him of this great accomplishment of faith. Then you go over, and Saul gets jealous. Saul gets upset. Saul starts trying to kill David, and David's on the run in chapter 21 now. You go a few chapters later. And he's on the run from Saul, and he has no weapons. And I talked about this last week, and I just wanted to kind of draw a conclusion to this and go into one other point here. He's on the run from Saul. He's afraid. And he goes, and we read this last week, where he came to Abimelech, who was the priest, the high priest. And he was looking for food, and he was looking for a weapon. But the interesting thing is the weapon he looks for, and he says to Abimelech, he says, now is there not a spear or a sword on hand? I brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's matter was urgent. Which he's lying about. It was the king who was chasing him, and he was running. And the priest said, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, behold, it is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you would take it yourself, take it, for there is no other except it here. And David said, there is none like it, give it to me. And David rose and fled that day from Saul, and went to Achish, king of Gath. Now, remember I told you last week, my opinion of this is that David was trying to make peace with the king of Gath, because he needed to find somewhere he could go. And he was taking back this sword of Goliath. Now, it's interesting that the Philistines it was like 5 kings. And Gath was one that was well known for an area of giants. And some people said that, he had Goliath had other brothers, because there's another story about another Goliath, or a house of Goliath, or whatever, that somebody was killed. Another giant was killed in the house of Goliath. So, what was David doing? My opinion was, in this fear that he was in, running from Saul, he was trying to make peace with, his enemy, to try to, get some sort of protection. What I was saying is that fear will do that to you. You'll turn back and try to trust in the things of the world. You'll turn back and try to trust in the world system. You'll try to find a way to make it work in your own strength. If I can just work harder. The funny thing is, that employment. Now, I want to explain something to you, and I was just thinking about this week, and this is an amazing thought. Working, where we go to work, and all of us do, we work, we make money, right? That's the world system. That's not God's way of doing it.